Hello there, listeners and viewers. My name is Alise Artamonova. I'm a lawyer who works on business and human rights, and together with the Ombudsman's Office of Latvia, we are having a discussion today with Gabrielle Holly from the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and we will discuss more broadly what is expected of businesses with respect to human rights, and also delve into some aspects of Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is currently being developed in the EU, and we'll refer to it as CSDD or CSDDD. Thank you so much, Gabrielle, for agreeing to have this talk. Could you please shortly introduce yourself and let us know more about the work that you do?
Hi, Alise, and thanks so much for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you. My name is Gabrielle Holly. I'm a senior advisor here in the Human Rights, Business and Tech Department of the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and we are Denmark's national human rights institution. Our institution's been working on the business and human rights agenda for more than 20 years now. And in that time, we've worked closely with business, with civil society actors, and with state stakeholders to push for business to better respect human rights. To do that, we develop expert analysis and tools and other resources. And at the moment, we have a dedicated work stream which looks at the emerging legal and policy landscape, which regulates business impacts on human rights. I lead our work on these policy and regulatory initiatives with a focus on the upcoming EU laws, including, as you mentioned, the CSDD.
Great, nice. It's good to hear that you bring together actually different stakeholders, including businesses in your work. And now to bring some context to our talk, it would be good to understand what is the relationship between business and human rights. Could you please explain how do businesses impact human rights?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, I think we all acknowledge that business activities, generate jobs, revenue, innovation, and goods and services that are really needed to realize human rights. However, it must be acknowledged that companies, whether they're local or multinational or public or private, can also have negative impacts on the rights of individuals and communities. And there are myriad ways that companies can have these kinds of impacts on people and planet, whether it's by procuring goods and services from suppliers which have poor safety standards, as we saw in the case of the Rana Plaza factory collapse, or failing to address discrimination among your own direct employees, or by selling products and services which can cause harms when used, for example, where surveillance technology is sold to an oppressive state. There's almost no aspect of life which is not touched by business activities. And so there's a strong need to make sure that businesses are conducting their activities and engaging in their business relationships in a way that respects rights.
Yes, and so for several decades, I'd say there's been legal scholars, business scholars, civil society organizations and others that have been trying to find a solution for minimizing different negative impacts of businesses. And one of the biggest milestones has been the adoption of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or the UNGPs, back in 2011. And these set a clear expectation under Pillar 2 that all businesses have a responsibility to respect human rights. And this has also inspired the OECD to include a chapter on human rights in their guidelines for multinational enterprises for responsible business conduct the same year. And later, again, it has further led to development of the OECD due diligence guidance. And one thing that I think is clear from these international standards is that it is not enough simply for business to state, we are respecting human rights. Instead, what they need to do is also know what their impacts are and show to their stakeholders how they are addressing them. So this is where human rights due diligence can be used as a tool. And could you describe what the human rights due diligence is?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, the overarching responsibility of business under these main international frameworks is to respect human rights. And human rights due diligence is one means by which companies can discharge this responsibility. It's commonly described as a risk management process, taking inspiration from corporate due diligence processes. But instead of looking at risks to the company, it looks focuses on risks to people and the enjoyment of their rights. So the process of human rights due diligence has four main elements. So companies are expected to first identify the impacts they have on people through their operations and through their business relationships. It's only by knowing what impacts you have on people and planet that you're able to address them. Secondly, companies are expected to take effective actions to address those impacts and anticipate not only actual impacts that are occurring, but potential impacts that could occur in their own operations, in their business relationships. Thirdly, you're required to track the effectiveness of those actions. and make sure that you would adjust the actions depending on what your findings are in relation to the effectiveness assessment. And then lastly, communicate on how they're addressing impacts. In addition, there are expectations that a company will provide for or facilitate remediation where there are harms to the enjoyment of people's rights. It should be said that human rights due diligence is a continuous process rather than a one-off due diligence process, as is commonly the case in corporate due diligence. And it's most effective when it's embedded throughout the company's operations and business relationships.
So human rights due diligence, we could say, is also sort of about working step by step to understand and reduce harm to people, and you have to do it continuously. It's not really just one time. Yeah. So,
exactly right.
And what is happening on the field, actually, are companies adhering to these standards and conducting human rights due diligence?
Yeah, and I think that it's fair to say that a lot has been accomplished in the decade or so since the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were adopted. Now, I think the idea that businesses bear some responsibilities with respect to human rights is pretty widely accepted, at least among leading businesses. But this recognition hasn't always translated into better outcomes for rights holders negatively affected by business activities. And we still hear routinely stories of severe business-related human rights impacts, both in third countries outside of the EU, which supply EU businesses, including deaths from a factory fire in Pakistan, which supplied a European fast fashion brand recently, but also within the EU itself. For example, in the case of labour abuses among migrant agricultural workers in a range of different states within the EU itself. And so there's a broad recognition, I think, that soft law instruments like the UNGPs, which have a largely normative power to them, are not sufficient to drive widespread uptake of human rights due diligence by business and pathways to remediation for affected rights holders. And so I think in recent years, there's been a real recognition of a need for a harder, more enforceable requirement on business. And so as a result of that, we've been seeing this trend toward the development of legislation, which makes human rights due diligence a legal requirement. We already have laws in France and Germany and Norway. And right now, at the EU level, legislators are negotiating a new directive on corporate sustainability due diligence, the CSDD we mentioned, which all member states will be required to implement in their national laws.
Yeah, so seeing this development of local laws in France and Germany on mandatory human rights due diligence now has led to the need to level the playing field, right?
Exactly.
And then, of course, the rights holders are also asking for stronger accountability from companies. Well, but now I also have a question. Is there a relationship between human rights due diligence and corporate social responsibility, the CSR?
Absolutely, and it's a great question. And I think that there's a range of concepts and terms that are often flying around which relate to sort of business impacts on rights or business responsibilities or responsible business conduct. When we talk about corporate social responsibility or CSR, it's a very different process to human rights due diligence that I've just described. CSR is often associated with a softer, more voluntary action by companies and corporate philanthropy that aren't always related to companies' core business activities or the impacts they have on people and planet. And so CSR as a concept does fall short of the expectation on businesses to actively manage their human rights, which we're seeing emerging in these due diligence laws, and which is expected by the process of human rights due diligence outlined in the UNGPs.
So yeah, this is a really important point because we are not talking about philanthropy today, but something that is really expected of all companies globally. Yep. And now, speaking again of human rights due diligence, the way how the CSDD only includes large companies in its direct scope might signal to smaller companies that they will not be affected. But yeah, so in Latvia, we have large companies. We also have multinational companies that operate here, but mostly it's just small and medium-sized companies. So could you explain, please, if CSDD will really just apply to large companies?
Yeah, that's a great point. The CSDD, the scope at the moment will cover large companies and medium-sized companies in certain high-impact sectors, and that's still being negotiated, but is likely to be agriculture, extractives, and textiles. But just because the CSDD only applies directly to a smaller pool of larger companies doesn't mean that it doesn't have an impact indirectly on a much larger pool of companies. So, for example, SMEs that are part of the value chains of larger businesses who are directly captured within the scope of this law will be indirectly affected. larger companies within scope will undertake due diligence on their value chains, and SMEs that are part of those value chains will be expected to meet certain human rights and environmental standards if they want to remain a business partner of that larger company, which is captured by the law. This is because the requirements of the CSDD ask companies who are captured by the law to manage risk and show that they're taking all relevant steps to prevent or mitigate human rights and environmental impacts under threat of administrative sanction or potentially civil liability if they fail to undertake due diligence to the requisite standard. This means they're going to expect their business partners to really lift their game, and may also include contractual requirements to meet certain expectations and codes of conduct. So there will, of course, be expectations on SMEs that are part of the value chains of these larger companies. So it shouldn't be the case that SMEs should think that they're completely exempted from this law just because it only applies to larger companies.
Yes, and I think that local businesses can already see in their supplier contracts with French or German companies that there are provisions on due diligence. And as well, more and more companies have these supplier code of conduct that you mentioned, and these are some examples of cascading.
Yeah.
And to understand better how it works, could you elaborate on this concept of value chains? Why is it not enough for a company to just make sure that it doesn't have negative impact in its own operations? Why is the entire value chain important?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe it's worth just before we get into that, breaking down exactly what the value chain is. So the value chain covers three main components. So that's the supply chain, so where a company procures goods and services which are needed to manufacture its own goods and services. And often when we think of that, we think of labour abuses potentially among suppliers which aren't meeting the expectations that a company may have of working hours or kind of good working conditions and health and safety. It also captures your own operations. So that can involve impacts which you have on your own workers or the communities in which you operate, but also how your internal processes, including how you design and market and sell your products and services, how they could impact on human rights outside the company, in the broader community and among consumers. And then lastly, the third component here is the downstream value chain. So that's everything that happens after a good or service leaves the company, including impacts on consumers and end users and the broader community. And so it's important for a company to take a holistic approach to assessing how it assesses its impacts. For many companies, impacts associated with the procurement of goods and services, which are used to manufacture the product, might be where most of their risks lie. For example, cobalt, which is an essential component to the manufacture of electronic vehicle batteries, is often mined under very poor conditions with huge health and safety risks. However, for other companies, for example, those in the tech sector, the most severe impacts are likely to occur as a result of the use of products and services in the downstream. Without a broad approach to identifying and addressing human rights impacts, which covers the full value chain, severe human rights impacts might be missed and go unaddressed by a company's due diligence processes, because each company is going to be a little bit different, given its particular operating context, given the products and services it manufactures. So it's very important to take this holistic view in order to properly assess what kinds of impacts you have on people and planet.
A lot of times companies rely on subcontracting, and it's also important that these human rights responsibilities don't get lost in different subcontracting provisions. And
yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that the EU is committed to doing is preparing a set of model clauses that will be used by companies, and they can use those in their supplier contracts, but also in other contracts potentially, to essentially introduce requirements, legal requirements in the contract that suppliers meet certain expectations in the code of conduct. And as you rightly say, we're already starting to see these practices happening as French and German companies are trying to meet the expectations under their own laws. So I think that the use of contracts is one very clear example where I think SMEs and other business partners are likely to be brought sort of somewhat within scope of this law, even if they aren't directly captured. But I think that there's also a requirement on all companies who are directly captured to take this very broad approach to assessing what kinds of impacts they have. And that requires a value chain scope.
Yes, but I also feel like there might be several companies that are worried about their ability to devote time and resources for management of their human rights risks, especially smaller companies. So how can small and medium-sized enterprises conduct human rights due diligence if they have limited resources or no leverage?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the things that the UNGPs tries to do is take a really pragmatic approach to this. So under the UNGP's human rights due diligence is expected of all companies. So regardless of size, sector, operating context, all companies are required to do something to identify and address their human rights impacts. But the due diligence is expected to be proportionate to the size and circumstances of the company. And what good due diligence looks like for a large multinational company will be very different to what good due diligence looks like for an SME. So taking steps to identify what impacts you have and do what is within your kind of power to address them, that's what's expected of SMEs. And the EU has in fact published guidance on human rights for SMEs that really goes into these sort of issues around how SMEs can relevantly conduct human rights due diligence. It includes some practical steps which SMEs can take and examples of questions to ask about your own business operations and to ask of your relationships with suppliers and others. I think one real challenge there that I think you've highlighted is that the SMEs are likely to have fewer resources and often less leverage to address human rights impacts. But there are a number of ways that SMEs can really increase leverage and maximise resources, including through collective action, whether acting through a business association and getting some support there, or by teaming up with other state and civil society and trade union or other business actors as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it seems that also the CSDD in some cases will require large companies to provide some support to SMEs in their value chain. So that should also be more reassuring to SMEs. And it's good to know that the expectation is not as high for smaller companies, that they can tailor their processes to the size and overall context of how they operate. But it's good that you brought up collaborating with different other stakeholders, because stakeholder engagement is also a very important point. It is true that impacts on human rights and the effectiveness of measures adopted cannot simply be measured by doing a desktop research. So could you please elaborate on the importance of stakeholder engagement and which stakeholders should be engaged in different processes?
Yeah, absolutely. And stakeholder engagement is critically important. I think I can't overstate how important it is when you're undertaking due diligence to include the views of stakeholders at every stage of the process. It's the best tool we have to make sure that companies are conducting effective due diligence and not just taking a checkbox compliance approach. Ensuring that the views of relevant stakeholders are embedded at each stage of the process, from identification of impacts to developing interventions to address identified impacts, to tracking and monitoring and communication and providing remediation, absolutely critical to make sure that you're doing due diligence, which is going to meet the requirements of your context and meet the requirements of your stakeholders. Who the relevant stakeholders are will really depend on the company context, but it could include workers, local communities at a factory or at the site. It could include consumers and end users of products and services. It very much depends on what your operations are and what kind of people you affect through those operations. There are various means by which stakeholders can be consulted, which can be used depending on the context. Engaging with civil society or trade unions or other representative groups can be a really great way to identify what kinds of impacts you might be having on a particular stakeholder group. Organising outreach meetings accessible to stakeholders and making sure that you have good communication channels on the actions you're taking so that those relevant stakeholders can know what you're doing and then can kind of assess for themselves whether or not what you're doing is enough. You can also ensure that you have a complaint or grievance mechanism that's accessible not just to your own employees, but to a broader range of potentially affected stakeholders, such as workers in your supply chain or consumers or community members, as this can be a really valuable channel for receiving stakeholder input, as well as resolving grievances and generating a social license to operate.
Yes, thank you. I can easily see why stakeholder engagement is so important, because human rights risks are also external risks. It's not the risks that companies simply assess just by reading or trying to decide what's the actual impact. So, and then the next point, which I think is really important that I want to discuss, is distinction between sort of a cut and run approach and stay and improve mentality when we speak about supply chain management, because oftentimes when I hear different discussions in Latvia about supply chain management, it sounds like successful supply chain management is just dropping risky suppliers, terminating business relationships, but that is not really the approach that would be in line with the UNGPs and I guess also the CSDD, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The UNGPs are very clear that disengagement should be a last resort. Really, the fundamental logic of sustainability due diligence is that change happens through constructive engagement. A company's responsibility to respect rights carries an expectation they'll remain engaged and work to prevent or mitigate negative impacts, or use leverage with business partners. And we don't yet know the final text of the CSDD, but it's highly likely that the CSDD will take a similar approach, acknowledging that there will be some circumstances where disengagement is required. If there are severe impacts with no prospects for improvement and you have no leverage in the situation, then that might trigger disengagement. But the expectation is that companies will continue to engage and only exit where there is no other option. There's also an expectation that companies not only consider the impacts of staying, but also what kinds of negative impacts might arise as a result of their exiting. So I think that there's a real need to kind of consider a lot of different impacts in the round, not only whether you are causing or contributing to impacts by staying, but also if you leave, what happens then? And disengaging responsibly is really core here if you do need to take the drastic step of disengagement. But when to remain in place or disengage can be very tricky and context specific. And the UNGPs give specific guidance for businesses operating in particularly challenging contexts such as conflict zones. So I think that UNGPs, again, can be a good touchstone here.
So in general, the idea behind the UNGPs is to remove harms, to minimize the negative impact. So if a business relationship is simply terminated, then where's the guarantee that this that company that has these harmful practices won't just find another client and carry on as usual?
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's really the point, that you have to look at what are the practices throughout your value chains and find solutions for minimizing the negative impacts.
Yeah.
And another important question, because we're nearing the end of our discussion, is just how will the new CSDD rules be enforced?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the due diligence law is, I think, only as good as its enforcement, really, and making sure that companies actually comply with the obligations. And so what the CSDD contemplates is a range of different accountability and remedy mechanisms. And these include, I think, three main things. So one, there is a requirement that companies will establish a complaint mechanism accessible to a very wide range of stakeholders. And as we noted earlier, that can be a really powerful means of really identifying what impacts that you have on stakeholders. Indeed, what the CSDD contemplates is that if a company receives a credible complaint, it will be taken to have been identified for the purpose of the due diligence process, meaning that they will need to undertake actions to address that impact through their process of due diligence. Secondly, the law contemplates administrative supervision by national supervisory authorities, supported by a network of supervisory authorities at the EU level, which will have powers to investigate, to sanction, to order cessation of non-compliance, and receive as well what are called substantiated concerns from a broad range of stakeholders, essentially allegations that a company isn't meeting its due diligence obligations. So there is a channel as well for affected rights holders and other stakeholders to take complaints directly to a supervisory authority. And then lastly, there is a civil liability mechanism contemplated here. So companies could potentially be sued for harms arising as a result of a failure to conduct due diligence to the requisite standard. So we have here, I think, three quite powerful means by which companies should be encouraged to undertake due diligence in the spirit of the law and make sure that their interventions are effective. Because even if you meet the obligations of the law to the letter, so you tick the box of everything you're required to do, if those interventions aren't effective, you're not going to be insulated from criticism, from civil society actors, from other actors. And so I think it's really important to make sure that that your due diligence processes are as effective as possible. That requires, really careful consideration of the needs of stakeholders, which again is why stakeholder consultation is so critical here.
Yes, and this is also very different from sort of a SORT enforcement rules that they have under OECD guidelines, where national contact points only have power to issue recommendations. And yes, and I'm sure that civil liability considerations will be largely debated locally when we'll need to transpose the CSDD into local laws.
Indeed, I think that's been a very contentious issue in the negotiations also. So I think that what exactly the civil liability mechanism will look like is still being decided, but it will definitely be in there, and there will definitely be a means by which companies can be sued. Yes.
So this is us coming to the end of discussion. And to conclude our talk, to leave our listeners with something they could explore further, could you please share where can companies find guidance from your institute?
Absolutely. So we have a considerable amount of guidance up on our website, and we'll share a link to that with you and the audience here. There's a lot of guidance for business on how to identify and address human rights impacts. There's also, I think, quite lengthy analysis of the various laws that we've been talking about today. And analysis of other things that are of relevance here. So that we have a toolkit which will assist companies to undertake human rights impact assessment to understand what kinds of impacts they have on people, as well as a range of other tools. So I'd encourage anyone in the audience interested in learning more about this to look at our website and check out the portal of resources that we have there.
Perfect. Thank you. I think one of my favorite resources that you have is this puzzle, how all the different EU laws that bring new responsibilities and duties for companies with respect to human rights are connected. This is a really useful one. So thank you so much, Gabrielle, for this insightful debate. I think there's a lot for the listeners to take from it. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. See you another time. Bye.